Hello, everyone. Please enjoy this conversation that I recorded with my friend Sam Asumadu from Media Diversified, in which we discuss the far right in places like Ukraine, Myanmar, and the militaries of countries like the US and UK. It's a wide ranging scope for an episode, but I hope it's informative. We'll be putting out another episode this week that Francis and I recorded with Adrian Bonenberger, our former co host, who was recently in Ukraine helping to evacuate his in laws and has a lot of interesting perspectives about the conflict. That should be out in the next day or so. Also, I wanted to raise awareness of an issue on Sam's behalf. Media Diversified is currently on strike in an attempt to protest the unequal response on platforms like Twitter when users report abuse against Black people, specifically Black women, and Romani people. You can see more information about this under the hashtag #DoWeCount2. Anyway, as always, thanks for being a listener. Sorry for the late release, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. He ain't gonna jump no more.
Hello and welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It is myself, Nate, flying solo today. However, I'm joined again by my friend and now second-time guest, Sam Asumadu. How are you doing, Sam?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm currently in Glasgow. I'm having a sort of, well, it was supposed to be a month off work. It has not turned out like that. But yeah, there's been a lot of culture as well, though, so I can't complain. But yeah, nice to be back on. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very
did
welcome.
I invite myself again?
You did, but it's all right. I mean, we always have a fun time talking, and I wanted to talk to you about some research you've been doing. I think under the larger umbrella of what we might call extremism online, but specifically as relates to the far right in Ukraine. And you've also been doing some research to write an article about we'll call it the general situation in Myanmar. And you found some links between them sort of conceptually. So I wanted to start with Ukraine and the situation there and get your
absolutely.
thoughts.
But I wouldn't say it's just about online, either radicalization or violence. It's in real life violence as well that I'm looking at, even more so because that is what actually on the ground affects the people. But yeah, exactly. So I'm glad to be able to talk about it and talk through these ideas. Well, connections. Basically, what I'd say is what I am is more or less an ethnographer. So I look at groups of things. I make connections between situations, between peoples, like communities, and so on. And this is what I'm finding with what's going on in Ukraine and currently Myanmar, and has been for quite a while. Both actually situations. I think so the crux point with Ukraine is 2014. I think in Myanmar it's a bit earlier than that, maybe 2015. But all of these things have long histories. They don't just pop up and oh my gosh, there's neo-Nazis here. Oh my gosh, the Buddhists have become fascists. It's got a long history.
Yeah, and I find it interesting too talking about Ukraine because I recognize the fact that we've talked about this a little bit on What a Hell of a Way to Die and some of my other shows, that the argument that I kind of hold to is that this is a serious concern, and I'm very wary when people try to hand wave it and say, "Oh, no, that's just propaganda. You're repeating Putin talking points if you bring up the preponderance of far right imagery." American listeners might recall the legacy of a guy named Eric Garland, who wrote this deranged nonsense thread in 2017 about game theory that weirdly had nothing to do with game theory, but was basically just a guy who knows nothing about anything, but has taken way too much Ritalin and is very,
indeed.
very...
But do you know what it was about him? He's actually quite a good fiction writer. And that's exactly what he should be doing. That's why so many people engaged with it, because it was well written.
Yeah, and so basically, Eric Garland once called me a Russian agent and accused me of being in with the FSB, and I found this very funny because, you know, at the time I was like, hey, I've literally never been to Russia, and I probably can't go to Russia because all of my personal information, like that of many, many other people, was compromised in the Office of Personnel Management hack, which would include my entire top secret clearance packet. So safe to assume that if I tried to go to Russia, if I was even able to get a visa, that I would have an interesting time there. So I'm good with not.
What's going on with these information handler people? Did you hear? Yes, I think it was yesterday that Ukraine apparently have released a list of 600 Russian spies with various names, some of them whose handles or Twitter, not Twitter, emails are literally 007. I mean, I thought it might be a joke.
Well, to be in my job when I was in the Army, you had to at least be eligible for a top secret clearance, and I eventually was able to receive one. I never used it. I never handled any top secret information, but I had to get a clearance, and clearance required a big background investigation. That looked at basically everywhere I'd lived in the last 10 years and anyone I was friends with who wasn't a U.S. citizen. Thankfully, this was before I moved overseas. But the point I'm making is that I can emphatically say that I am not a Russian agent.
No. What is that? So a friend of mine actually works for which department? The money department, UK money.
What is it? The Exchequer or HMRC or whatever?
HMRC. And so I won't say what he does, but to get the job, and he's got a long history of being, he's worked for various people. He's a great, he's a programmer, kind of technical person. And I can't say what he is doing. But to get the job, he had to get MOD clearance because of some of the information that he'll be doing, even though his job is absolutely more or less nothing to do with MOD. But you still need that clearance to do what he does. And one of the questions was, do you or any of your friends or people that you know want to violently attack the state or bring the state down or something? I mean, this is like the other day, there's the viral thread where this woman said that she didn't get a Biden job because she said, yes, I did have.
I do smoke marijuana, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, ridiculous. I mean, he obviously said no, but it's like, yes, hasn't everybody got friends like that?
It's very funny because I remember having basically been forced to, when I wanted to be an adjunct lecturer, so like lowest rung of the academic totem pole, teaching a single class a semester, teaching English composition when I was in graduate school. In order to work for a state university in New York State, one of the things I had to sign was basically a pledge that I would support and defend the Constitution of New York State, and I would not encourage anyone to overthrow the state government, which seemed bizarre because it was not even the federal government; it was just the state of New York. But then also,
did you read their constitution or whatever it is?
No, it was just something I basically had to say because I mean it's illegal for teachers to go on strike in New York State. There's a lot of crazy stuff like that. But it's funny because you've jogged my memory. I was doing I think it was for my top secret clearance. It may have just been for a secret clearance. I can't really remember. But one of the questions they asked, it was very, very funny, was like, have you at any point in your life been involved with any efforts to import drugs into the United States of America? But it said after that question, if yes, no further responses required. It's just like, yeah,
all right, mate,
fair enough. Yeah.
They're guiding you somewhat there.
Yeah, I get the point here. Yeah.
It sounds like that woman who said, yes, I smoke marijuana was just an idiot, really. I mean,
well, yeah, it's like there are some states where it's legal, but you're applying for a job at the federal government for Joe Biden's administration, a guy who's anti-marijuana legalization.
And the coldest answer I saw to her, somebody who replied was saying, well done for saying that you've never had a proper job, because anybody who ever had a proper job would know not to say yes.
Exactly. No, I mean, and that's something that I learned in the Army too, because also it's like, if you do put yes because you're an idiot or it's on your criminal record, you have to have the same answer over and over and over again. Like you have to always get the answer right, which means you have to remember what date you put and stuff like that. Yeah, that's the thing. Like,
was there any mental health questions, I wonder?
For what's it called? I don't recall for my background check, but I think that the big ones they were concerned about were things that would make you like prone to being blackmailed, or things that would make you prone to like having, like, if you have financial problems, if you have really bad credit, if you have a lot of debt, stuff like that. If you had like DUIs or convictions for substance abuse, that would be a problem. But like, let's be perfectly honest, if they excluded everybody who had had experienced periods of binge drinking in their lives from secret clearances, no one would have a secret clearance in America. So with all of those parentheses closed, talking about our bona fides here as not being Russian agents, I think that like my take has always been that in Ukraine, it is extremely important to call it triage. Like, yes, it is a problem. And I'm not even hand waving the problem away that there is a serious far right presence in the Ukrainian military and also in society. But I think the biggest driver of far right recruitment is the fact that Russia invaded. And I think until you solve the problem that Russia has attacked and invaded Ukraine, like you're not going to make that problem go away. But that being said, like here in the UK, in the last 24 hours, you shared with me an article in the Times where the headline was Azov Battalion, quote, "We are patriots, we're fighting the real Nazis of the 21st century," unquote. And it's more or less an article trying to launder the reputation of the Azov Battalion, which are a far-right organization that's been incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard. Similarly, in the Financial Times, there was an article entitled, quote, "Don't confuse patriotism and Nazism," unquote. "Ukraine's Azov forces face scrutiny." And similarly, it was a article that more or less...
Honestly, that actually really annoys me, because what they could put is nationalism, and nationalism is just as pernicious as Nazism. But they've used the word Nazi because that repels people. That's far too far. What are they saying?
Way too much. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think the thing that we'd point out here is that I think that we are in a bit of a crisis in the sense that the only reason why more arms didn't get out of Afghanistan when they deployed Stinger missiles and things like that to Afghanistan to support the Mujahideen fighting the Russians was the fact that immediately at the end of the war, once the Soviets withdrew, various government agencies and military agencies spent a lot of money buying them back.
Oh, right. So we're going back to the 80s now, just to give
we're
our
talking about,
listeners...
1989.
Yeah.
Not recently, but 1989, 1990, they were buying those Stinger missiles back. And the thing about it is I am obviously concerned at the prospect of dumping hundreds of millions of pounds of weapons, ammunition, etc., into Ukraine, because you are, in some capacity, not everybody, but at least in some capacity, you are providing anti-tank missiles and, the heavier side of small arms to organized white supremacist movements. Yeah, far-right groups. So one of the things that you have been researching is the history of, for example, attacks on Roma communities in Eastern Europe or in Ukraine by far-right activists and, people related to Azov and things like it. And my concern, I think, when I consider like what the end of this war might look like and, the consequences of it, to a large degree, I am concerned about an armed and re-energized far-right movement in some of these countries. And obviously, like, the Russian invasion is driving a lot of that, but what is that going to look like, post-war, if you will? And so I'm interested in your thoughts.
To situate your listeners before we do that, it's just to give a little bit of history about who we're talking about. I mean, I think there's lots of various neo-Nazis groups, and as you mentioned to me earlier, you can find all these people in veteran groups, in youth groups, in all sorts. But Azov, I think, is the most important, mostly because of the political element. Obviously, people are going to say, "Oh, right, they're only 2% of the thing," but that's not the point. They were elected once, they were exposed as neo-Nazis. So that's what makes them important to me. So just a little bit of background. I'll read something from an article that has been one of my sources. So Azov is a far-right, all volunteer infantry military unit whose members, estimated at around 900, are ultra-nationalists and accused of harbouring neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideology. So the unit was initially formed as a volunteer group in around May 2014, and that was out of an ultra-nationalist Patriot of Ukraine gang. So it's not new. They just got a name, basically, let's say. And also, and another group was the Neo-Nazi Social National Assembly, SNA group. So both groups already having on their own were sort of engaging in xenophobic and neo-Nazi ideals and physically assaulting migrants. So this is before 2014. 2014, that date is important because they came together to start doing it. So to start targeting the Roma community and basically anybody who opposes their views. And of course, yeah, there we are. That's the Azov people. But as a battalion, the group fought on the front lines against pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk, the eastern region of Ukraine. You cannot separate the far right in Ukraine from separatists in Russia. They're yin and yang, both sides of the same coin, I'd say. So, Putin can say whatever he wants. And I've already told you, I've called him a cunt, but they're all interlinked, and I don't think they could exist as they are without each other. Yeah. So
it's something that I also would point out, and I think is fair to drive at, is that Ukraine is getting singled out, obviously, because of the sheer amount of money and material that's being handed to them by Western governments. But Russia also has a significant neo-Nazi presence in football hooliganism, in the
Absolutely.
separatist stuff you talked about. And plenty of far-right people in the West have gone to Russia for sort of like training and fellowship things. And obviously, Russia dumps a lot of money into far-right causes around the world through dark money and investing in politicians and political parties and things along those lines.
Europe
So
is rife
like,
with this. Like,
the
I
thing
was
here
doing
is
also
that,
some research just on Sweden
Yes.
earlier. I'd forgotten there was an article I published about the attacks against migrants in Sweden in 2013. Now, one writer who wrote for us early days was saying to us that Sweden created racism. Now, Sweden have laundered their reputation by these smiley, happy people who are taking refugees. Those refugees get shot on the streets, and then nobody does anything about it. So we can't talk about Ukraine without talking about Sweden, without talking about Russia, without talking about Finland. They all have this element, and it's getting worse. And in Ukraine, some of the research I've done, apparently, so now, I mean, we haven't gone on to what's happening now, but like there's neo-Nazis in 3 continents who've come to Ukraine to fight against people, not just for ideology. These are violent men. These are people who want to engage in this. This is how they get trained. That's how they get more violent, being part of these groups.
Yeah, and I think about it too that there are a lot of Ukrainian nationalists active in North America, for example, particularly in Canada, because Canada took in a lot of people who were, for lack of a better word, what the Germans called Hilfswillinge. They were people who were Ukrainian volunteers to fight with the German forces against the Soviet Union. And obviously, at the end of World War II, if those people had been deported back to Russia, the Soviet Union, rather, they would have all been killed. Famously at the Battle of Stalingrad, when the German forces surrendered, the German prisoners were ethnic Germans, Wehrmacht prisoners were put in prison camps. Many of them, a significant number of them, didn't make it home because of poor conditions, but they were the ones who did survive the camps by the mid to late 1950s were sent home. Whereas Hilfswillinge, the what they call Hiwis, the Ukrainian and other Eastern European volunteers fighting with the Wehrmacht, they were shot on the spot. They were all killed on the spot. So that would have been the fate of a lot of people, post 1945, if they had been deported back to the Soviet Union. And many Ukrainian, these were far right Ukrainian nationalists who effectively, were forced to choose between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and they chose Nazi Germany. Similar stories exist with people in the Baltic states, in the Balkans. So this isn't a unique thing to just Ukraine, but I don't think you can talk about race politics, racism, white supremacy, and xenophobia in Western European countries as a separate phenomenon from what we're describing in Ukraine with ascendant far right nationalism. I don't think that there's that much of a difference in terms of overall worldview between someone who agrees with Azov and someone who agrees with the BNP.
And we haven't actually even talked about Islamophobia yet, because then you bring in Myanmar and the Buddhist nationalists there.
Yeah. Myanmar is an example too, I think, of where you have a situation in which because of political events and the sort of, call it like the sort of storytelling aspect of reporting, people see Aung San Suu Kyi as this liberal icon in Myanmar, but from what I can tell, she has received a significant amount of criticism for basically not intervening or speaking out or really doing much at all prior to the military coup with regard to the Burmese military basically attacking civilians and driving them across the border into Bangladesh from one of the
for about a decade.
And similarly, one of the grimmer things about that story that I recall from reading reports on it was that at the time of this uptick in pogroms against Muslim citizens of Myanmar in Rakhine State, in the border states near the border with Bangladesh, Facebook didn't have anyone working on their moderation team or in their offices in Southeast Asia who spoke Burmese at all. And not only that, but I don't know, I know you've reported from Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know if it's like this there, but in Southeast Asia, this is the case for sure, that
when you buy cell phone plans and cell phone minutes, oftentimes there are promotions. So you don't use any of your minutes or data when you browse stuff like WhatsApp or Facebook. So there's a huge like discount to be on Facebook in a country like Myanmar. And so you're in a situation where people were basically sharing incitements to violence and fake stories about, crimes committed by Muslims against Buddhist temples, against Buddhist priests, against Buddhist civilians, accusing Muslim men of raping Buddhist women and children, things like this. These were typically like meme format or like stories written where it was an image.
I used to see them on Twitter.
Yeah,
I don't see them now.
The writing was all in Burmese, but basically like an image where it was hard coded. It wasn't text, so you couldn't search for the text and you couldn't auto translate the text, which meant that moderators would have to speak Burmese to be able to understand. They have to be able to read in Burmese and see these images. This stuff was all being circulated on Twitter.
Facebook has really failed the world, hasn't it, when it comes to human rights?
This was all being circulated on Facebook, and it's one of these things where you look at it and you think, man, you basically walked into a situation and figured the only thing you would do is be a net positive, and you didn't even think for once that like disinformation might be shared. And I remember that Facebook, at the time that this was happening, Facebook was on this PR push that they were trying to develop technology to create like autonomous aircraft that would expand internet access, like that you would, they wanted to create some project where like, oh, we're going to create like solar drones that like have relays on them so we can increase internet access into developing countries. And
you sort out your moderation
exactly.
before
And
you're
like, thanks guys, I appreciate that you want to build internet drones to give people Facebook.
You're going to fall on my head.
But like, yeah, can we please?
Which has literally happened recently. Oh no, it was Amazon. Apparently one of their drones fell.
But the thing I would say is that Facebook then turned around and they did hire Burmese speaking moderators, but they were all, for example, based in Singapore. And it's like, I feel as though when your website has precipitated ethnic cleansing, like you kind of need to take a harder line with it. And I see, so much of this, like, if you were to ask, hey, what's the direct link between this? Well, maybe there's not a direct link between the situation in Ukraine and in Myanmar, but I do think that your point about white supremacy.
I think there is actually, but we'll go into it. Go on.
Well, I would say the white supremacy angle, but also the
and the religious angle,
and using
the charismatic leader
and
angle,
using technology to gin up, basically ethnic hatreds that have existed in those regions for a long time, but like, it's no longer a rumor that someone told you at the bar, that your neighbor told you. You open up Facebook. Facebook, in Myanmar's case, being more or less subsidized by your telecom provider, and you have access to all this stuff.
They're all complicit. I mean, the thing is, with the moderation thing, I mean, there's literally now a court case that's going to be against Facebook or Meta, whatever they want to call themselves, in Kenya, because even when they did get moderators there, they didn't look after their mental health. They paid them pittance. And now they're going to be a class action. I believe it's a class action. It was announced yesterday against Facebook in Kenya.
Yeah.
So what do you think of those moderators there in Singapore, which they finally got? Yeah. What incentive have they got to do a good job? And for one, if they want to keep the job, they just want to, pass through. Yes. Okay. That's fine.
But imagine what they're going to face too, like in a country where people, are sharing calls to action, but then are also sharing footage of people being assaulted. I mean, I have a friend who worked for a Facebook moderator in Austin, Texas, as a subcontractor, and his beat was basically having to moderate reports of footage, people submitting videos that were being flagged as showing abuse of animals, and the stuff that he saw was so horrifying that he just it gave him such bad post-traumatic stress disorder that after 3 months he had to quit.
Yeah,
I remember Adrian Chen, the writer. He's Filipino-American. He wrote that piece about Facebook moderators in the Philippines, and one of the constant refrains from the people in those cases was that most of them didn't last more than a year, and a lot of them had been, women who had basically been told like, hey, here's a great job that you can do, on your own schedule as a working parent. But after not too long, like not only did they quit, but it made them basically unwilling to take other work and leave their kids with childminders because they had to flag so much footage of child abuse that they couldn't, after seeing that,
this is we talked last time about radicalization, but in some ways, please, yes, leave Facebook as soon as you can before you get radicalized. But then in the opposite direction, you're also getting radicalized because you so much fear that you're like probably not letting your children out.
Yeah,
or
I mean,
whatever
but
equivalent it
that's
is.
the thing, right? Isn't it that, I mean, like, I feel as though if I were to look at our conversation so far and talk about like an overarching point here, it's that I am concerned by radicalization when I see people sharing stuff that basically makes it seem like, well, Ukraine is all Nazis, so that means Vladimir Putin is right. That's pretty rare, but I do see that stuff from some time to time. Or the opposite direction, you
These
know.
are old guard anti-imperialists who need to move on.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
or
world has moved
or
on.
the opposite, you know, where people get so into sort of like objectifying Ukrainians that it just becomes like, look at these hot Ukrainian chicks. Please don't look at the skull and crossbones patch on their, you know, that kind of thing. Like it's bad either way. But I think the thing that maybe it's a banal point, but I think that the extent to which this stuff lets you have a filtered version of reality, and you know, but that's, and it also allows you to disseminate propaganda. You know, you find yourself in a situation where you're basically being told that you're being hysterical if you raise the point, or that you're somehow being a Putin apologist if you raise the point. They're like, this is a real problem.
You're making me think that they like should actually teach ethnography in schools as a sort of way to pass the media, as a media teaching
Well, I
point.
certainly think that like media studies would be a good, like people love in this country particularly, they love to just tell joke after joke about like millennials and just Zoomers with their media studies degrees. But it's like, do you know who really could use media literacy skills? People who are like 50 and older. And
Yeah.
I guess what I was going to ask you was, I know you did a little bit of research about stuff like Roma communities being targeted and Roma individuals being targeted. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that really fast, and then I wanted to ask the question: are you concerned that like you think that this conflict is going to breed more, call it violent extremism against marginalized communities in Eastern Europe?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the research I've been doing so far is looking at 2018. So not that long ago, but in 2018, basically these ultra-nationalists, they weren't specifically Azov, but they're springs off, you know, they've all got connections together. In this case, it was, let me think, what were they called? It was a radical group, apparently called Sober and Angry Youth in Ukraine. But basically what they did was they attacked a Roma settlement near Lviv. Please pronounce it for me.
Yeah, Lviv, that's correct, yeah.
Lviv, all right, so thank you. In June 2018, they killed one person and injured several, including one child. I mean, in fact, let me think, the people that they attacked, I think there was one woman. So they killed a 24-year-old man. They seriously injured 4 more people, a 10-year-old boy, 2 19-year-old men, and a 30-year-old woman. So obviously they don't discriminate where it comes to who they attack, at least. But yeah, so they went into this settlement. And I mean, even now you've got to think, why are there settlements? Why haven't they have houses, but you know, that's where they have settled, and that's where they want to be. The Roman people in Ukraine, and these people invaded. I can't think of a better word for it. They invaded their camp, their living space, their home, and attacked them. And of course, all these, and there's been other attacks. Sorry. So I think around that time, there's been 5 or 6 attacks. Of course, the Ukrainian police do little or nothing to combat this, or to even a little media campaign against these sort of people and these sort of attacks would be useful, but they don't do that. But basically, there was a quote from a Ukraine researcher at Human Rights Watch, somebody called Tanya Cooper, and she said this attack should be a final wake-up call for Ukraine's police to take decisive action against hate crimes. Radical groups have not been held accountable for their attacks on Roma people, which could not have emboldened them to commit more attacks. Now someone's dead. She's saying now someone's dead in 2018. I tell you, there's a lot of. I think there's likely to be more people who are dead. Sometimes it's not reported. I mean, the Roma people don't want to interact with the police that much because they're already oppressed by them and attacked by them. Now come in the far right. Who are they? Are they going to report they're dead to them or their attacks? So basically, this group of men in mass, they attacked the settlement in Lviv in the evening, and they were armed with knives. It was reported, at least, that they were from the Sober and Angry Youth arm. I mean, that's an interesting name. Anyway, some of the members of this group have ties to the former volunteer battalion Azov, which we talked about before and gave a little bit of history of Azov. I mean, what we didn't do with Azov is going into the political form of that now. You know, the leader was an MP up until 2019. He's 42 years old. I'll remember his name soon. But basically, these people have, the Azov obviously have been implicated in allegations of unlawful detention, torture, and other abuses, which actually we haven't gone into as much. I mean, recently there's been reports about the covering bullets with pig's blood because they're about to kill Muslims. I mean, that sort of propaganda has history going back years, centuries.
Yeah, and it's also kind of insane too, because there are a significant number of pro-Ukraine Chechens who are fighting for the Ukrainian military. So the idea of framing this as some sort of like, you know, crusade against Islam is deranged, but also like that doesn't even make sense in the conception of the fact that like there are Muslims fighting for Zelensky's government, for an independent Ukraine, as well as Chechens, you know, under Kadyrov.
I mean, we all contain multitudes. Come
sure.
on. And sometimes home is just home. But yeah, they should be talking to their comrades, I guess. But, you know, I expect their comrades who have an ideology that's sick aren't going to be listening.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just find it so, yeah, it's grim because it's, I mean, it's not a surprise that a white supremacist worldview is hypocritical and self-contradictory. But when you run up against those obvious contradictions, there is that moment of just sort of being like, have you thought this through? And then you realize like the point is they know it's absurd. They do it anyway. Like it's a stupid argument to bang on about hypocrisy, but like it doesn't help you. It doesn't.
That's something that keeps me up at night. You know, hypocrisy. I wish it didn't.
I wish pointing it out accomplished anything, because obviously there's times when you're like, surely you see how absurd this is, but that's the point, isn't it?
That's why ethnography is so important, connecting, so people understand when they hear these things connected with other things. Obviously, now even though I can never pronounce her name either, Ansi Swang, whatever, even though she was like, you know, there's a military coup, all of that. Her background is in the military. Her father was a famous a general there. So that's why I believe that she is so entangled with what's happened against the Rohingya there. Yeah. And then also, you know, she's like one of the foremost neoliberals in the world, in my opinion, as is Zelensky, which is another reason why I invited myself onto the show, is to talk about the links between these two. Because for me, you know, as soon as she was released, she's pictured with Tony Blair, with all of these people, you know, he's out there talking to NATO, etc., etc. And that, I don't think they're particularly bad people in themselves, but I think they are willing to accommodate far-right nationalism to get where they want or what they want for what they think is the greater good. What they are thinking is very short-term, however, because they're thinking short-term of those weapons that go into their country. They're thinking short-term of the radicalization. And so this is what, all these links. But then we can't, I mean, I can't. I know this show is more talking to an American audience, but we can't forget Britain in this and our far right that are infiltrating infiltrating is not even the right word, but the British Army. And so there was a Twitter thread that the journalist and author Matt Potter did the other day, which, you know, really struck me. And basically, I'll just really quickly read it out. He said, anyone rightly fretting about Ukraine's far-right Azov battalion should spend an hour on the British Army community boards. ARSE, ARRSE, bills itself as the unofficial voice of the British Army. It's where soldiers and veterans hang out, and it's long been a violently far-right hub. I'm not going to tweet the screenshots I took of soldiers calling for, and in some cases putting themselves forward for the killings of Black Lives Matter activists, seeding conspiracy theories about supporting supposed Black and Muslim plots against the country, violently racist rants. If you're looking, it's all over the place there. Knock yourself out, you can see it. But we need to talk about the far right taking hold of the British Armed Forces too, and how a group of people who openly fantasize of revolution to stop a minority takeover of the country, about shooting, deporting, disenfranchising or torturing anyone who isn't with them, can be trusted to defend democracy. He's talking about the British Army here, not Ukraine, not Myanmar, not anywhere else.
Well, I mean, I think about this stuff there's been this long struggle against this in the United States as well. I think that my experience in the U.S. military was that like you basically were allowed to be either completely apolitical or far right, but those were the only acceptable political orientations. And one of the things that I recall is that post Trump winning, there was a lot of similar stuff with very hateful, racist, homophobic, anti-feminist, misogynist, Islamophobic stuff being posted by troops online who had their units, had their affiliation with the U.S. military in their Facebook bio, stuff like that. We've had the Marines, particularly the U.S. Marines, are particular about this. That like they have so many of these like toxic online groups where they're super misogynist and racist.
Yeah. I mean, police as well, and who
I mean, oh my God,
New York State Police.
There's the cops. The NYPD have like a board that's like their like forum rant board. And famously, they got so mad at Bill de Blasio that like they were on that board fantasizing about like because they had heard rumors that his daughter had a problem with heroin, about trying to slip her a bag of heroin that would kill her.
Oh my God.
And it's like,
oh my God.
That's the mayor of your city, and you're like, how can we kill his daughter? Like,
wow.
That's that. I mean, I always want to know like the article that you're planning on writing about this. What is it? What's
the overarching? Yeah. I mean, you write these articles and you want them to be read. So what I will be doing is doing a sort of compare and contrast with both leaders of Myanmar and Ukraine. Anthony Sweeney and Zelensky, looking at NATO links, and then also looking at neoliberal links, Tony Blair, etc., blah blah blah, and then the far right. And I mean, that whole Rwanda thing was very fresh in my head, but I'll probably bring in that. All I would do is look at the connections and what is going to happen going forward with all these arms, all this equipment that is going to all these countries where there's a big far right nationalist element, and I will include the Buddhists in that. The rhetoric that the Buddhists are saying in Myanmar is what is radicalizing and people there.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate you making time for this, and I'm interested in seeing how the final article turns out. But I also think that, relevant to a military audience, I really appreciate that point you made talking about, that, like, on one hand, it's absolutely valid and important to criticize the far-right links and overt far-right affiliations in, things that we perceive, in organizations that our governments are supporting financially in Ukraine, for example. But also, I think that's a really good point to say that same rhetoric, that same mentality is not exactly foreign to troops in Britain or troops in the United States. I know from my own experience in America, I mean, it was a long time ago, but I just remember that rhetoric was there for sure. And I was an officer.
None of this is new.
I was an officer. I was the guy you had to hide that shit from. Definitely guys who were enlisted soldiers in the barracks can tell even more stories about what starts with Confederate flags and gets a lot scarier, a lot faster. So, there's a lot out there. And I feel like, I appreciate our conversations because we touch on a lot of topics, but I feel like there is a thread connecting them. So thank you so much for your time.
Next time, let's do Priti Patel, because we've got some interesting information on her now, haven't we? Via Declassified.
Yeah, I want to talk about her more at some point, because that whole story about she's an interesting one, and it's going to be very funny because I can already see it happening, that at the turn of a dime, or the drop of a hat, the Tories are basically going to get the British media accusing Starmer's Labour of being too white and male, and they're probably going to win. It's going to be Priti Patel, basically.
Well, but that Labour can't do all women shortlists anymore because there's more women in the party. Yeah,
it's funny, right? But Labour has more women in the party than any other political party, certainly amongst councillors and MPs. But they've never had an actual female leader, other than my MP Harriet Harman being the.
Well, look at the female leaders of the Tories. Even though Theresa looked like some sort of robot, soft and this and that, but they are absolutely ruthless.
Oh, 100%. I mean,
Labour also have their ruthless people, but they're undercover. They're trying to seem like they're the nice, caring party, so they can't look as ruthless as Margaret Thatcher. That's all that's going on.
And also Labour is more ideologically committed to austerity and, neoliberal economics than the Tories are. The Tories just want to be in power so they can skim money off the top. They don't care what they have to espouse.
Shock doctrine, it's smash and grab, and that is exactly what they're doing right now in the last few years. I think with Cameron, they were a little bit trying to look like they did good and diversity, all that nonsense. But now is smash and grab time. Keep watching.
Yeah. Well, Sam, thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you?
So they can find me on Twitter at Samantha Asumadu, on Substack under my name. If they Google me, they'll find all my articles on ceasefire and open democracy and Telegraph and whatever. Yes, I've written for the Telegraph. Sorry, whoever thinks that's bad, sorry, I've just done it. And also on being on LBC. Yeah, I've had an argument about that earlier. What platforms we should go on, but I like to get the word out to as many people as possible if I've got a bee in my bonnet. But yeah, I'm around.
All right. Well, I will link to that in the show notes. But thank you so much again for your time, and for everyone listening, we will speak to you next week.